Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We're on the Bruce train today, but we're also on the 90s train. I am so excited to visit with my friend Gary. Gary, welcome to the podcast.
Jesse, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a Bruce fan for those sorts of things. Just saw him, in fact, in Pittsburgh in August, which is my hometown. So that was Springsteen Ground Zero for a while, but grew up in Pittsburgh. I've been here in Detroit since 1982 as a practicing music journalist, writing for a variety of publications, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and of course, doing books, which is the reason we're here tonight.
Yeah, so the new book 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. You were nice enough to arrange a copy for me, and it is beautiful.
Thank you.
It is a beautiful book. It would be perfect on a coffee table. It is just a great book to pick up and just look at a page and do.
Pretty good for bicep.
Yes. So we're going to talk about that, but I always like to start at the beginning. So talk about where you grew up and what kind of music were you listening to? Were your family listening to?
Okay, so I grew up in Pittsburgh, as I noted, and I was fortunate enough to have a brother who was 11 and a half years older than I was and was a bona fide hippie counterculture. So when I was at a very young age, I was hearing all that great classic rock. Beatles, Airplane, Rolling Stones. I remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, my favorite song, all my friends' favorite songs was whatever Disney movie or Saturday morning cartoon was out. Mine was Born to Be Wild. And that clearly planted a seed in where I would go. It lit a musical fire under me. My folks were musical too, not in terms of being musicians, but they liked music, they liked art. We went to musicals, we went to, Lord knows, they took me to see Wayne Newton once. We would watch things on TVs. I had a good grounding in the arts.
You have two interesting stories there, Gary. Those who embraced their parents' music and then just expanded their listening as they grew older, or the people who rejected their parents' music and then when they turned 35 go, you know, that Johnny Cash guy my dad liked a lot? He's pretty good. But, yeah.
I wish my dad was hip enough to like Johnny Cash. We're talking more Mel Torme and Sinatra and then the big band stuff. I never rejected that, but it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily the music of choice. But I did recognize as I became a little more knowledgeable about music when I started writing about it for a living, I realized that, okay, I'm glad I heard that stuff. I'm glad I heard Tommy Dorsey and
Yeah.
Glenn Miller. I understood through that. I couldn't have verbalized it when I was a kid, but I really got an understanding of songcraft and arrangement and things like that that have served me well doing what I do.
The other thing is siblings play a big part of the discussion. Similar to yourself, that is not an uncommon story where someone was the younger sibling and their older sibling, be it brother, sister, gender neutral, that they influenced the younger child with showing them what was the good stuff. And every once in a while, I get a rebel. My older brother was really into grunge, so I went to heavy metal or I went to
Oh,
jazz, right? So you talked about you're a Bruce fan. Can you remember when you first discovered Bruce, and can you articulate what about his music spoke to you?
so there's two phases to this. One was I first heard about Bruce when I was running around with friends at Flagstaff Hill at Carnegie Mellon University, and they were setting, and this was 73 or 74, and they
Okay.
were setting up for this free concert that turned out to be Bruce Springsteen. Now, we didn't stick around for that because we were too young and our parents wouldn't let us hang around there. But I at least heard the name then. That's one of those concerts that if everybody who said they were there, he would have filled Meadowlands Stadium. When I was about 12 or 13 or so, and I was starting to read magazines and a little bit of Rolling Stone, but Circus and Cream, and Springsteen's name would pick up. And then I picked up The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle first and listened to it. And at the time, I would call myself a prog heavy metal kid. So it wasn't necessarily in my wheelhouse, but I knew it was good. And I knew, especially when you were listening to Kitty's Back or E Street Shuffle or Wild Billy's or something, you knew something was going on. And maybe like listening to Frank Zappa a little when you're a kid that age, it's maybe beyond your level of comprehension, but you recognize the quality of it. And then when Born to Run came out and cover a time in Newsweek, and I picked up the single, and then that was the rocket ship that I became a Bruce fan and went to see him at the little theater shows where he was diving into the crowd and telling the 5 minute stories and the songs. So I got indoctrinated at the right time.
I always like to preface this, the amount of times you've seen Bruce live is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are. But
Correct.
are you someone who counts? And if so, how many shows?
I've played around with counting and I realize I don't do it. So I'm probably in the 50s somewhere. I'm not a traveler per se, as much as I said I just went back to Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
It was a good excuse to visit some friends. But I have traveled work to cover tour
sure.
openings and to do interviews and such. Like I say, my best guess would be somewhere in the 50s.
Were you a big reader growing up?
Absolutely. That was something that was big in our house too. My parents were both readers. My brother, who's an academic, is a history professor. And I was that geeky kid that enjoyed reading and enjoyed writing at
Hmm.
a very early age. Most kids don't know. So the die was set.
Did you know you wanted to write for a living?
Not till high school, maybe,
Okay.
and this is when all the other dreams go away. Like when I realized I was not going to play third base for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I was not going to fulfill my mother's dream for a nice Jewish doctor. But ninth grade biology took care of that. And
Yes.
so little by little, and then I took a journalism class in high school with an excellent one of those teachers who is with you the rest of your life. And I took it on the hunch that you do writing maybe, and sure enough it was just okay, yeah, this is what I'm going to do.
So I ask this sometimes, but is there one or two road to Damascus moments where you finished something and you went, yeah, this is pretty good. I can be proud of this.
I've had, knock on wood, and I don't mind saying I've had quite a few stories
Okay.
where I've did the ones that come to mind immediately. I was covering the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions
Yeah.
down, and so despite learning that at 63 I can't do the all-nighters quite like I used to, I came home from Cleveland saying, yeah, there was that. And the other one that comes to mind immediately is I did a profile of Joe C., who was Kid Rock's sidekick. He was
Okay.
this little 3 foot 10, 4 foot whatever, little person, not a dwarf or anything, but he was part of the act. And after he passed away, I did a magazine profile of him and really dug in and talked to the family and talked to the people in the band. And when I typed the last word and hit send, it was like I knew I'd swung for the fences and connected.
That's nice.
But like I said, I'm happy to say there have been quite a few of those. The thing with what I do, though, is you're on to the next thing
Yeah.
so quick.
Yeah. How were you drafted? Were you chosen to do this essential albums? Tell me how this happened.
I walked outside in the bush and out my front door was burning. No, no. This is the third book I've done with this publisher. They tend to generate their own ideas. So they came to me with this. And the nice thing about it is they basically give you the idea and let you structure it. It's a very invigorating discussion with them about what the book's going to look like. And then you run with it. So, it was really generated from within, but I was comfortable that they were giving me plenty of leeway to make it my, or because there's 3 dozen contributors, our book.
What, and they're the ones who decided to start with the
Yeah,
90s?
they decided, I guess there is a creeping feeling in the industry that we're hitting 90s nostalgia point. We've been immersed in 80s nostalgia. Now we're starting to hit 90s.
I do see on Amazon that there are now soliciting for 80s. Yeah.
That'll be out in the spring. The Ascent 501 Essential Albums of the 80s is done.
Yeah.
It's being designed now, and that'll be
Okay.
out in the spring.
That's nice. It is a beautiful book. It's in obviously full color, but there are so many iconic album covers that just you go, oh yeah, that one. And so, what was your thought process and your team coming up with the why 501 and how did you make your choices?
501 was the publisher's pick.
Okay.
501 rather than a 500 just to make it unique or
Yeah, a little fun.
something.
Yeah.
And the selection process. Have you seen the Hunger Games
Yes.
or the battle scenes from Lord of the
Right.
Rings?
Yeah.
A lot like that. We probably started with a long list of more than 2,000 and then went through the bloodletting of knocking it down to 501 sounds like a good number until you're trying to encapsulate a full decade of music into just 501. So a lot of, like I say, we came up with the big long list, like these are the ones we need to consider. And then it's knocking them down and making a lot of hard decisions, encapsulating the idea like, okay, you are, initially it was going to be the best.
Right.
And that's a different thing than the essential. You know, the
Yes.
essential. So what we tried to do when we made it the essential, it was like, okay, here are the 501 albums. If you want to understand the 90s, listen to these. That's why if I were doing a book of the best, I don't think In Sync would be in it, or I'm not sure Britney Spears would be in it, or Backstreet Boys.
No, but I know what you're saying. And one of the things I loved is there was a wide diversity of there was pop, there was rock, there was jazz, there was hip hop.
And
Um,
we've got gospel in
yeah.
there, and that was an adventure.
Did you guys try to limit yourselves? Okay, we've got 10 decades, we've got 500 rough songs, that's 50 a decade, or did you go, a year
Yeah.
would if we only got 45 on this one, that means we give 55 in this year.
Not really.
Okay.
No, we just picked the
Okay.
501 and then saw how it shaked
Okay.
out. And there was a little shaking and baking after that, but really just a
Yeah.
little. You
Okay.
know, we wanted it to be the real choices.
All right. So here's the question everyone's dying to know. If Human Touch and Lucky Town had been one album, had it might have made the list. Okay.
Possibly. And I have nothing. I have found myself surprisingly listening to Human Touch more than I would expect and putting some of those songs on repeat,
Yeah.
even things like Real Man and Real World.
Yeah.
Essential was a nice tag to have on this.
Yeah.
We have the ghost of Tom Joad in here.
I was
I
going to
think,
talk about that
but I think that's essential
for
from
that
that
decade.
decade. You can make an argument about the others. I thought about the greatest hits just because of those four new tracks and
Yeah.
because it did so well. I really
Right.
felt like that was an album that introduced Springsteen to a
To
lot, combined with Streets of Philadelphia,
yeah.
brought a new audience to him. Again, I'll keep using the word essential, but it was, yeah, Tom Joad was the essential one for the 90s. I felt like they released some very good albums, and I feel this way about Bruce. They released some very good albums during the 90s, but they weren't albums I would even consider essential in their own catalogs.
Yeah, and I think that's a good discussion to have. Better Days or Land of Hope and Dreams are my favorite Bruce tracks. And then you throw in Thunder Road and Born to Run and Backstreets and Promised Land. But that's a personal choice. But if you were trying to tell, did you go to a show last year?
Yeah, we had one in Detroit
Okay.
on that
So
lake.
that was the static set list, right? That was a lot of the wailing and gnashing of teeth. And mine was okay, he hasn't turned in a long time. He has a story he wants to tell. And if you honestly look at the set list, it does a good job of representing the many eras of Bruce Springsteen, which is important to do, right? I guess the question is you're sitting there going, how do I tell the story of the 90s? And there are things that, if I was telling the story of Bruce Springsteen, I would talk about certain albums that may not be my favorite, but I think are an important part of his story. That's what you guys are going. How do I tell this decade, right?
Right. And what did this mean to the overall understanding
Yeah.
of the decade, and a decade where, you know, part of my take on the 90s is this was the last golden decade of the album. Because as we get to the end of the decade, we started to get into file sharing and P2P and everything that led to the state of the music industry as we see it now. Whereas in the 90s, though, you were still buying albums, and the number one album of the week would sell 1 million copies. And the industry was focused on the album as the medium of musical communication. That was, so you're talking really about the albums that told the story. And there was such an explosion of styles and genres, whether it was the new pop movement or, of course, what we call grunge or whatever you wanted to call
Yeah.
that. Americana became Americana during the
Right.
90s. And they had a lot to consider about the journey that music took during those 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was looking and thinking of some of my favorite artists, and I was very happy to see that Bruce made it with Ghost of Tom Joad. I do agree that it's certainly not an album that I go to a lot, but I understand the importance of it the same way if you're trying to tell the story of the 80s, Nebraska plays an important part of his songwriting and his history. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
there are a lot more Bruce albums in the 80s book, I can
yeah,
tell.
yeah, I would think so. What was I, in fact, that's one of the things that led to this podcast is I had been guest on an 80s podcast, and we were supposed to each bring our three favorite albums of the 80s to discuss, and I realized I could have done three Bruce albums easily,
Easy.
right?
And then
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if
Um,
you're having this issue, this as we've been celebrating 1984 this year. And
yeah,
of course, born, isn't it weird to see him lumped in almost as a trend? Because we think of him so much as so much more. And
yeah,
we understand he's so much more, but then he's in the whole 1984
yeah,
commemoration. And it's, oh, he was more than a blip.
yeah,
He was better than Thriller. So
yeah.
I don't know if you find that or not.
I do, and it is what I love knowing is that from my perspective, when you think of Western Stars and Letter to You, you go, wow, someone at this stage in their career is still putting out, I think, significant music.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's the rarer artist. And it's interesting. So when you go into these decades books, you get into the whatever happened to,
Yeah,
and I think it gives you a greater appreciation of an artist like a Springsteen, Dylan, James Taylor, and so many others, Pearl Jam, but the ones that are creating significant music, and whether it sells or not at this juncture is no longer part of the discussion because nothing sells in
well,
this. Yeah,
when they did Western Stars, the film, and he did that cover of Rhinestone Cowboy, I think in a different decade, that's a top 40 country hit.
sure.
I think it's a crossover. I think the DJs would have, for fun, here's Bruce Springsteen doing Glenn Campbell, and it would have, because he did a great version of it. But that's just not the world we live in. One of my other podcasts is Sylvan Groth and I are going through every John Hyatt song in
Oh, wow.
alphabetical order.
Wow.
So talk about a niche. I go from Bruce Springsteen to John Hyatt.
Actually tracks.
Yeah,
There's a lot of commonality. You're talking about the way
yeah,
they write songs and why
exactly.
they make music.
Yeah, absolutely. Sylvan often talks about that it going the individual song in alphabetical order because John does write albums, right?
Yeah.
And I think Bruce too. Bruce thinks a lot about the order of the songs. You look at Darkness, you look at Born to Run, you look at Letter to You. There was something great about putting on Pet Sounds and hearing it and just this journey that Brian and the boys were putting us on. So, thoughts on the loss of the album?
I think there still are some albums out there and being made. People just aren't listening to them as
Yeah,
albums, so they're not necessarily being celebrated. You listen to what Kendrick Lamar's doing,
yeah.
those are albums. Even Eminem's last album, those are albums. Blitzen Trappers album.
Jason Isbell. I think
Right,
Jason
yeah,
Isbell.
yeah. No, the people who are making, there are still people making albums as albums. I'm not willing to call it a lost art.
Yeah.
It's lost consumption. And I do bemoan and get grumpy old man about the taste. And it's funny when I'm talking to classes and I do some lecturing and some teaching about reviewing and covering music. And when we do get into discussions about that, and you see the ephemeral connections that some of the younger teenagers are making with their artists compared to the connection we still feel with the artists we made a connection to at their age, I do question if they'll still be talking about Chappell Roan when they're our age,
Yeah.
or so maybe Olivia Rodriguez if
Yeah.
she's, or and certainly Taylor Swift. But there are just a lot of artists that feel like they're ultimately passing through.
So a young guy from Jersey, Jake Thistle, very big YouTube following. He's going to college. He's been writing music. He joined us and told the story that he was like 10 or 12 and John Hyatt heard he was in the audience and they came in and John had him sing a song with them. Penn said that because of YouTube, people are doing things that normally you wouldn't think they do. Someone who wants to become a magician or a juggler sees someone do an act and go, oh, it's possible. And they learn to do it because no one told them what that person is doing is actually incredibly difficult.
Right.
Jake's point is too many people think that they put out a song, it catches fire, and they don't understand how much work is involved in creating music. Any thoughts on that?
There's two sides to that argument. Sure,
Isn't there?
somebody sitting in there, can do something that somebody in 1975 could not in terms of making, and thanks to other forms of technology, actually make something that sounds like a record.
Yeah.
I think where the work aspect of it comes into their lives as a performer and as a sustaining artist. In other
Yeah.
words, they're not out there sweating it out, and so they don't necessarily understand what it's going to take to maintain
Hmm.
and how much work is involved in writing 100 bad songs for every one good song. That filter doesn't exist in the same way that it used to. So anybody can put anything up, whether it's on YouTube or Spotify or whatever they're choosing to use. You can put it up if you like it. And I guess the only litmus becomes if people listen to it or not. But that's a whole different set of metrics now. It's algorithms, it's knowing how to work those technologies in order to get an audience and not necessarily get that audience based on the merit of the music. I still have faith that the good stuff rises and stays. The music that's going to be momentary will be momentary, but it does distract from a lot of otherwise good music.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Gary, was there an album that, as you're doing the research and working with your partners, was there an album that kind of surprised you that made the cut?
That would be fine. Boy, oh boy, now I have to remember the one it was. Okay, Savage Garden. We were at a concert, and it just so happened that several of the people in that row were also writing for the book. And one of them brought up Savage Garden, and I was like, no, no way. But then we had this 5-person discussion, and I walked away. Okay, it's in the book. You
That's
guys
great.
convinced me to understand the place it held. Okay. I was a music snob critic in the 90s. I'd even talked to the band a couple times, but that album made a significant impact in an important way. Okay, it's in the book. Damn it.
So I'm going to go back to you as a Bruce fan. What are some of the albums or songs that you tend to go back to that hold a special place in your heart?
Yeah, it's funny. Born to Run. So that was, I got into that at the time. But over the years, that became my start of the road trip album. And I would play it. And I even had it timed to when I got off the surface road and was hitting the highway. I was on the ramp getting ready for highway speed, was right when Thunder Road kicked in with the full band. And I played it on every family road trip. And now it's my kids' go to album.
Yeah.
So that'll always, just because that has a place in the greater fam, that'll always hold to it. The River, because I did my first music journalism on Bruce during the River tour. Ghost of Tom Joad will always have a special part or a special place because our newspapers went on strike in Detroit the year that came out. And I went to Chicago to see his Tom Joad show. And for the strike paper, he agreed to do an interview. So I got to have this wonderful encounter with him backstage with no refreshments. So it was just the
Oh,
craziest,
wow.
yeah, the craziest backstage scene, but a very appropriate interview because so many of Bruce's themes in general, as well as on Tom Joad,
Yeah.
made sense for the occasion, the reason that we were doing
Hmm.
the interviews.
What are other interviews? It sounds like that one was pretty special. Are there others that bring back pretty good memories that you're really proud of?
Oh man, there are
Yeah,
scores
sure.
of them sitting with the Who in a hotel room before they went back. They when they first reunited in '89,
Yeah.
with the three of them who were left drinking with Keith Richards in 1986, talking about the Stones' dirty work, talking to Brian Wilson when he came back with the album that had Love and Mercy on it, and having him disappear on me, not physically, but his eyes just rolled back in his head and he disappeared and went
So
away for 2 minutes and 34
I
seconds.
obviously would love to talk to Bruce. Bruce, Jason Isbell, there's wonderful musicians I'd love to. Someone asked, and I said, I don't know if I'd want to talk to Brian. Certainly not now. I think his health is
Right.
not well, but I'm curious.
He at the time was
Yeah,
and has remained damaged goods for
yeah,
all the reasons we know. And you have to
yeah,
work you it's hard to get in too deep and to
right.
get into the memories, and it is frustrating and sad. This particular occasion I mentioned was just freaky deaky. He was still under Eugene Landy's care.
Yeah.
And the guys around him, like when Brian went away and I'm looking at the whites of his eyes, I said to them, guys, and he said, oh, don't worry, this happens all the time. What do you mean this happens all the time?
Yeah.
This is not, no, what
Yeah,
the
this
hell?
is
But
not a good thing.
no, yeah, that's one of the, I often came away sad after talking to him. But you also got glimpses of the genius that was still there.
Hmm.
I mean, I always felt the film was the film Love and Mercy, the
Yeah,
one with
Love and
John
Mercy.
Hughes.
Yeah.
I always felt that film probably showed us a good representation of what went on in his head. And so he may not have been able to conduct a thorough interview, but in his head, he's putting together sounds that nobody else can imagine.
I was talking to someone and I said that I picked up his album of him just playing the piano. And I said, don't know if I'd listen to it all the time, but every time I listen to it, I enjoy it. And just hearing that. Yeah, Love and Mercy is one of my favorite songs. I
Yeah.
love that film. I'm at a comic book convention or a pop culture convention, and John Cusack's there. And the line is out the door with people would say anything and just all this stuff. And a friend of mine who is a caricaturist drew a picture of John in the Beach Boy striped shirts, the thing, and had it Love and Mercy. And that's what I had John sign. And I told him how much the film meant to me. And he said, Brian liked it, and that was enough for me. I didn't
Okay.
care if it didn't make any money. And he said, and listening to the unreleased tracks of them working on the Pet Sound session was all the research I needed to play the character. And I
Okay.
thought that
Yeah.
was amazing.
Yeah. No, that's a great attitude to have.
Yeah. And I thought that was really neat that, the idea of showing Brian during that heyday of his creativity. And then when he's, finds Melinda and does have a resurgent. And yeah, Brian Wilson, that soul album sounds dated at times, but I remember the joy of hearing new Brian Wilson music and just being happy.
And he made a bunch of other good records on the
Yes.
heels of that. That
Yeah, that's
was
really
to
nice.
see him have.
Yeah. So what's next for you, Gary? What have you not done that you want to do?
I think I would like to at some point do an artist memoir, a partnership
Yeah.
with an artist. Had actually been in discussions with Gary Rossington from Leonard Skinner about doing something, and it kept coming and going. And then, of course, he passed away. There were issues within the Leonard Skinner framework and the estates of the others. He wasn't so sure he wanted to do a book.
Yeah.
I'd like to take that on sometime and maybe distill an artist story for them. That would be fun. I'm fortunate in that I'm long enough in this career. I've done more than I imagined I would. I tend to be more grateful about what I've done than think about what I haven't.
What should I've asked you, Gary, that I haven't?
This is perfect.
Yes, indeed.
We nailed it all, and there's
Yes.
nothing. And I'm going to stick by that. And the other joy about this book, Jesse, is that we to work with so many people who are and colleagues, people who I write for. I write for their publications, and then they did that with me, or people, there are musicians in the book who I'm friendly with, or just some friends of mine here in Detroit who I knew to be articulate enthusiasts and intelligent. So just to be able to do that team kind of thing. And we're starting to plot out some of our signings and appearances here in Detroit. And that's going to be a lot of fun to just be with a gang
Oh, yeah.
and that was really, that's a sweet. I don't know if they'll say the same thing once they see the edited versions of their entries.
There you
So
go.
far, so far.
Before I let you go, though, I've got to ask you the Mary question.
Sure.
Jay Armstrong was a retired honor. He is a retired honors English teacher, but when he was teaching, he would give his students the lyrics to Thunder Road, and they would study it as if it was a poem, talking about the imagery that Bruce is portraying, talk about the themes he explores, and then he would ask his class at the end of the day, does Mary get in the car? So, Gary, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Absolutely. Without question. And we visited her again in Mary's place on the
Yes.
Rising. That's who we were going to see. And I had a chance, knowing you were going to ask me this, I was interviewing Hank Azaria about his new Easy Street band.
Yes.
And he concurs that she got in the car.
Thank you.
So you get two answers for the price of one here.
Thank you.
He should come talk to you.
He should come talk to me.
That guy is a true believer
Yes,
when it
and that's why I
comes.
said, and I would talk to him just as a Bruce fan. So yeah, I just would love that. 501 Ascension albums of the 90s, the music fan's definite guide, available everywhere. You get your books, local bookstore, online.
Trunk
It
of my car.
is, yeah, you say you've got some signings coming up?
We in the Detroit area, we've got a
Okay.
couple things coming up.
If
What
some
else?
if someone wants to reach you, what's the best way?
I would say there's a Facebook page and group, Gary Graff on Music, and Twitter is Graff on Music. Direct message me there at either
Okay.
one of those, and be patient. Not that I get a ton of fan mail, but those are the best places to find me.
Thank you. Sir, this was a blast. Thank you so much.
Oh, I had a ball. You.
Yeah, everyone go check out the book.
Well, I can even.
Thank you so much. Remember to be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.